What is that?
Niels Bohr. Niels Bohr had 6 sons and he had a lot of grandchildren. And nothing pleased Niels Bohr more than to play with his grandchildren. They had a summer home up in Tisveld, and the grandchildren would often come up. And he loved to play with them.
And now I'd like to introduce our guest tonight. You'll think it's really Einstein, because if you look at pictures of Einstein, he looks just like it. But his name is really Barron, and he has been presenting Einstein across the country since 1989. He goes through stints at libraries and schools, and he does all levels, high school, middle school, elementary. He's also directed and produced 2 upcoming shows that will be here in the auditorium. One is called The Matter of Heart on February 27th, and the other one is One Old Frog Looks at Life and Death, and that's on April 11th. And so you can pick up flyers out in the lobby if you want more information on those. So I think I went through all my notes, and now I would like to introduce Len Barron. Let's give him a big round of applause.
I do a variety of presentations on Walking Lightly, a Portrait of Einstein, depending upon the audience and the time. And one of the best ways to learn about someone is to work with them. And another lovely way of learning about someone is to know who they hang around with. So tonight you're going to hear a little bit about one of his dear pals, Niels Bohr. And when I started doing this, you know, when you get to be sort of an old man, you forget things. So I said, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll have a glass of water back there, and every time I forget what I'm supposed to do, I'll go back and get the water and sort of remind myself what I'm supposed to be doing. And sometimes I get it just because I'm thirsty. It was the beginning of June, and Einstein had just moved to Bern, Switzerland. It was a lovely evening, and he was having a late dinner with 2 of his friends. A nearly full moon was shining through the window, and on the spur of the moment, they decided to walk up to Mount Gurten, a sprawling mountain 18 miles south of Bern. And so they walked all through the night, arrived at the summit about dawn, time enough to marvel as the sun moved slowly toward the horizon, and then to appear in all its grandeur and fill the Alps in an aura of early morning mystic rose. The year was 1902, and Albert Einstein was 23 years old. He picked up that walking habit very early in life, but one habit he didn't pick up was driving. Years later, his wife would tell a visitor, "Oh no, my husband, he never learned how to drive. It's much too complicated." Of course, there were always people around quite willing to give Albert Einstein a ride. There's a lady who lives in Boulder, actually, who went to school in Princeton when she was a youngster, and she used to walk past Einstein's house on her way to school every day. Well, one day it was raining quite hard, and she borrows the family's car, and she's driving along, and she sees Einstein walking with an umbrella, only it wasn't over his head. He was using it as a cane. She pulled the car over and said, "Oh, Dr. Einstein, would you like a ride?" Einstein said, "Oh, no, thank you, dearie. I got my galoshes." It's a good thing that Einstein didn't drive, because he would have been a hazard. There's a small club in Princeton who had to stop their car in the street because Einstein was crossing the street, got lost in time, and just stopped in the middle of the street. You can imagine what would happen if he was driving. Well, his good friend Niels Bohr, Einstein and Niels Bohr were the two giants of physics in the 20th century. Niels Bohr, he did drive, but it was also a hazard because he had rules and theories for everything. If he was driving along and the light was red, he would speed up because it was going to turn green. Well, it was quite a hazard to be in the car with Niels Bohr. Both Einstein and Bohr had warm and comforting families, and they had wonderful siblings who they were very close with. Bohr's younger brother was 2 years younger. His name was Harold. They were inseparable, and as they grew up, you didn't know who you were talking with. And they were side by side in their group of friends, and they could go almost word for word and interchange. They had this extraordinary relationship. They were both wonderful athletes, and Harold even went to the Olympics for Denmark. Einstein. Einstein's sister, who was 2 years younger, was his closest companion for all of their years. When he was 8 and she was 6, they had free reign of the city. They lived in Munich. And there are 7 bridges that cross the River Iser. And what people did for entertainment back there, they just walked. And they would cross over these bridges and have wonderful times. Well, one afternoon, Einstein and his sister were walking along. They were going over a bridge. And Einstein said to his sister, "Maya, let's see how slowly we can walk across this bridge." She said, "That's a wonderful idea." So they began to walk. Well, they were walking for about 20 minutes. They had hardly covered any territory. And Maya looks at her brother and says, "Albert, I know how we can make this walk even more fun. Let's make believe we're birds and we'll fly across the bridge." And Albert said, "Oh, that's a terrific idea." And so they began. Well, when they finally got to the other end of the bridge, it took them over an hour. And then Albert turns to his sister and said, "Gee, I wonder what we're having for dinner tonight." So they were very alike, but they had differences as well. And one of the differences they had was their working style. Einstein always worked by himself. He said one time, "I'm a horse for a single harness." He had assistants from time to time, but mostly he was a solitary worker. But he did have assistants, and at one point he had 2 assistants. One was Banish Hoffman, and the other was Leopold Infeld. And Infeld talked about what it was like watching Einstein at work. Their routine would be, they would talk about ideas in the morning, and then they would go back home, and the next morning they would discuss the ideas and see if anybody had a good one. Anyway, Banish Hoffman tells this story about they were working in his office for a couple of hours, and they got stuck. They couldn't figure out what the next move was. And so Einstein got up and started to walk around the room very slowly, and as he often did, he would twist a lock of hair in his thumb, in his hand. And he's walking along, and this could go on for many minutes. No sign of tension on his face, just relaxed. And then he would stop and smile, and the solution was there. Banish Hoffman said sometimes when he was working and he got stuck, he would try the same thing, but it never worked for him. Yeah. So both Einstein and Bohr were very touched and connected with nature. They loved to be outdoors, and one of their great passions was sailing. Niels Bohr always had people around him, and so he had a rather large boat with two of his friends. And they would go out sailing, and for Bohr, he often would say, Bohr would love to tell stories, and often he'd repeat the same story. But it was always a pleasure for those who listened to it. And one of his favorite stories about sailing was that man and boat and water and wind is the grandest of all the collaborations between man and nature. He loved to sail. When there was no wind, he just adored the singleness of comfort and the calm. It's like floating in air. And he loved to be out in rough weather as well. Einstein occasionally would have people to sail with, but he mostly sailed by himself. He loved to sail in rough weather, and on several occasions he had to get towed in with a broken mast. His friends would get upset with him because he absolutely refused to carry a life jacket on board, and true to his fashion, Albert Einstein, he never learned how to swim. Einstein loved to be connected to the universe, and nothing felt better than he was traveling in a violent storm. That connection with nature had a major part in how he thought, because the energy in the universe is part of our bodies, and when we are open to that experience, all kinds of wonder occurs. Niels Bohr, well, let me share an Einstein piece first. Einstein said, "When I think of my manner of thought, I think that the gift of fantasy has meant more to me than my ability to absorb knowledge." When he said imagination is more important than knowledge, he was merely saying that knowledge will only take you so far. He said, you never think of a great idea. You can think of a good idea, but a great idea is a gift from the universe. It just pops out of the blue. Niels Bohr. Niels Bohr's working style was very different. He had to be talking to someone to figure out what he wanted to discover. He had to be working with someone. And he worked very slowly. He was in no rush. One time he was working with one of his colleagues, and they were working for an hour or so, and then they stopped working and they sat there, not a sound, for over an hour. And Bohr said suddenly, I know what we can do. We can begin that third paragraph with nevertheless. So they added nevertheless to that third paragraph, and then they sat and they were wondering again, and Bohr said, gee, I like the way the work is going today. He did many, many drafts, 8, 9, 10 drafts. Bohr wrote over 200 scientific papers. Most of them he never wrote by himself. He would dictate to one of his colleagues. So they're working on this problem one time. They get stuck. They just don't know what's next. So they're sitting there for a while, and finally Bohr says, oh, I have a good idea. Let's start all over again. Yeah. Yeah. Time was a friend. And sometimes it takes time for an idea to just pop out. Einstein and Bohr, their great mentors, were children. He said, if you want to see imagination and inventiveness galore, you don't look at adults, you look at a child. At a 2 or a 3 or a 4 years old, they are giants of imagination and inventiveness, and Einstein and Bohr were just dazzled by children. When Einstein was at the Institute for Advanced Study, they used to have visitors come by, and they had a nursery school for visiting lecturers and some of the staff there. Well, he loved to go down and watch the children and would get down and play with them in the dirt sometimes. Well, one day, this rather pompous professor, a physicist, came to the institute. And he walked into the dining room where Einstein was eating, and he sat down next to Einstein and he said, tell me, Einstein, who's doing the most important work at the institute? Einstein looked at him and he said, well, it just so happens that the most advanced work being done at the institute is being done at the nursery school. The professor got up, growled, and walked out. Einstein looked at a colleague who was sitting close by and he said, you know, I knew that fellow had no interest in the truth. Yeah? Children were great sources of wonder, and Einstein and Bohr absolutely loved them. You know, we give kids a lot of toys now. Kids back then didn't have much toys. You know, they could do wonders with a stick and a jump rope. You know, Einstein's son talked about one of his favorite toys. Einstein made it out of a little string and some matchboxes. And his son remembers he could make the most wonderful toys out of practically nothing. Niels Bohr had 6 sons and he had a lot of grandchildren, and nothing pleased Niels Bohr more than to play with his grandchildren. They had a summer home up in Tisveld, and the grandchildren would often come up, and he loved to play with them. He would take them on walks through the forest where, as everybody knows, the trolls dwelt. And putting the little ones on the handlebars of his bike, he would ride them to the beach. A photographer caught him going through all the motions of delighted testing to convince a grandchild that the cereal was the most delectable of foods. And then, turning philosophical, as he often did, he said, in their joyful eagerness, one witnesses the possibilities of human beings at their very finest. In a child, we see the wonder and awe within us all. In a child, we see the wonder and awe within us all. Einstein and Bohr loved to walk. The first time the young Heisenberg came to visit Bohr in Copenhagen, Bohr greeted his young friend with, let's go for a walk. They walked for 3 days, talking physics and making up games along the way. He loved to play games. He would turn a game into just about anything. You know, Heisenberg had picked up a stone and threw it and tried to hit something, and Bohr said to him, you aimed to try to hit that, right? And Heisenberg said, well, of course. And Bohr said, that was dumb. If you want to hit something, you don't aim at it. If you aim at it, the probabilities of hitting it are very small. What you want to do, you pick up a stone and you look in the direction of whatever you want to hit, and you throw it in that general direction the probabilities of hitting it is increased immeasurably. You see, if you get too much in your mind, all kinds of things won't happen. You know, all of us know the pleasure is when your mind is just clear. You know, all kinds of wonder can occur. Walking, again, was utterly crucial. Now, Einstein and Bohr, when they went for a walk, they didn't do this. You know, if they walk like this, that's almost like marching, you know? They walked real slow, and often they'd walk with their hands in the back of them. And if you do that, your chest opens up, you know? You walk along and say, oh, isn't that interesting? I had never noticed that before. Yeah, that's how they walk, nice and slow, and take their time, in time with their own rhythm. We live in a world which is very fast and very noisy, and what's real important is to find your own rhythm. When you're walking, you're in touch with the animal because we're all animals. You're in touch with the animal self, you're in touch with your own rhythm, and you're in sync. And when you're in your own rhythm, you just operate better. Your body is more relaxed, and the mind works beautifully. One of the dilemmas of our present time is youngsters are not walking very much. The nicest thing you can do for your children is to take them for a walk. Let's take an old-fashioned walk. I'm just bursting with talk. What a tale could be told if we went for an old-fashioned walk. So let's stick a while on this idea of walking. You know, in this time of global warming and concerns about the environment, running through all the literature is that if kids don't walk, if they don't spend time out in nature, they do not become environmentalists. And so, you know, it isn't very necessary to spend a lot of money on all kinds of wacky toys. You know, the great thing about walking, it feels good and it's free. So let me ask you, how many parents walk often with their children? Raise their hand. Ah, that's very nice. Okay, so walk twice as much. Yeah, because you cannot get enough pleasure out of walking. So walk, walk, walk. And, you know, when you're walking, you can do, one of my dear pleasures when I'm walking is to sing a song to myself, and I love to dance while I'm walking, you know. And another thing, how many people here, when Einstein was young, he walked all over the place, and his only friend when he was young was his sister, but he loved to be by himself, and he made puzzles, and one of the things about Einstein and Bohr was their sense of concentration. They could hone in on something for hours at a time. Einstein, when he was 5 years old, was building houses of cards. He got it up to 4 flights, and they fell down. And he started again, and he got it up to 6 or 7 flights, and it fell down. He went on and on. It got up to 8 and 9, 10 stories. He's only 5 years old. 10 stories, it fell down. He stayed with that until it got to 14 stories high. 5 years old, 14 stories high of cards. He did that because to be able to do House of Cards, you have to go very slow, and you have to pay attention. Very slow, and you had to pay attention. Niels Bohr, when he was about 7 years old and his brother was 5 years old, they were on the streetcar. And there was a woman sitting at the streetcar across the aisle, and she said to a woman next to her who happened to know the Bohrs, and she says, "Oh, that poor mother," because she was looking at those two kids and she thought something was wrong with them. But what Niels and his brother were doing were looking, their mother was telling them a story and they were looking like this. It's like when children really are watching something, I was like this. Everything, all the power of that individual is honed in on whatever it is. They could do that for hours at a time as when they got older. You know, most of us, you know, one of the great pleasures of life is getting lost in time. When time disappears, it's because you are fully engaged. And it's the most all of us have had the experience of you're engaged in something and then you look at a clock and an hour has passed by or 2 hours have passed by. Einstein and Bohr, they could do that for hours at a time. That sense of just honing in and paying attention. So I'd like to share a couple of stories that really touch on the act, as they're really metaphors for what Einstein and Bohr were. Niels Bohr, as I mentioned, always had to work with people. And so he had this house in Tisvilde, north of Copenhagen, and colleagues would come up in the summertime and work with him. And this very esteemed colleague came up one time, and he was surprised to see a horseshoe over the front door of Bohr's home. And he said to Bohr, "Bohr, you don't believe that horseshoe business, do you?" And Bohr said, "Oh, of course not. But they say it works whether you believe it or not." And Einstein. In the mid-20s, Einstein was world famous, and he would give talks all over Europe, get invited to give talks all over Europe. And in 1926, he was asked to give the main address at the German Physical Society. And Albert Einstein talked about one of his latest theories. He'd been working on it for 7 months. And when he worked on an idea, that's all he worked on. 7 months he'd been working on this idea. He thought he was close to a solution. So he talked for about an hour or so. There were about 400 people in this auditorium, scientists from all over Europe. He talked for about an hour and filled up the blackboard with equations. And at the end of the talk, the chairman said, "Well, does anyone have any questions for Dr. Einstein?" In that auditorium filled with scientists from all over Europe, there was not a sound to be heard. And then from the back of the room, this young man raises his hand. Turns out he was 18 years old. He said, "What Dr. Einstein has shared with us is quite marvelous, only the second equation, it doesn't follow from the first. It needs an assumption which is not proven." Well, everybody turns around. Who is this kid challenging Einstein? But Einstein's not looking at the student. He turns around, he looks at the blackboard. He turns around in a moment and smiles, and he said, "What that young man in the back said is absolutely true. You can forget everything I told you today." Once he found out something was wrong, he didn't waste any energy saying, "Oh, I spent 7 months, da-da." He just dropped it, and the next day he'd be working on another idea, you know? How many people are doing something that doesn't work, and they keep on doing it? Einstein said, insanity, do you do that? Well, maybe you won't do it as often now. Einstein said insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting something to come out different, you know? As soon as he found out something was wrong, whether it be his personal life or whether it be physical, he would drop it in a minute. So much time and energy is holding on to things that just don't work. So if Einstein were alive today, you know, at the turn of the 20th century, he changed our perception of space and time. If Einstein were alive today, I think he would redefine, give us another definition of time and space. I think Einstein would say, time was invented so we could change our minds. And space was invented. Every child knows that space was invented so we could dance. Yes, 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 yeah. So, an Einstein dance. Has anybody here heard of an Einstein dance? An Einstein dance is one in which everyone is rooting for everyone. Thank you. You've been a charming audience. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you.
We're at the Dairy Center for the Arts in Boulder, and we have our art opening tonight, which consists of Chuck Forsman and Leaves and Sky, and Dual Visions, the mystique of 13 artist couples, which is in our McMahon Gallery and in our Polly Addison exhibition space. The show's up until October 24th.
Originated about two or 3 years ago when a bunch of artists were sitting around at an opening here at the Dairy, and we looked around and realized that all of us had partners that were also artists, and we said, well, wouldn't it be fun to do a show of artist couples? We started out with about 15 or 16 couples, and we've been meeting over the past year. We've been having potlucks every quarter, and we've talked about what it means to be an artist who has a partner who is also an artist, and how that influences our life and how it influences our art, the ways in which we collaborate and influence each other, and the ways that it makes life better or worse.
It turned out better than I thought it would, and I think Kate's side's stronger than mine. But it was nice to talk about. I think the meeting's really fueled about what it means to be a couple, the challenges just involved with that, the challenges of getting enough time in the studio once you've taken care of the house, the kids, the spouse, all the responsibilities.
Well, early on as a group, we talked about how there's a possibility of collaborating on some work. And so I had this idea of having a window that if you were on Mark's side of the window, it would frame my work, and if you were on my side of the window, it would frame his work. So that seems to be often how we look at each other's work in our own studios. I'm looking at him for inspiration or thoughts or, critique, and the reverse happens as well.